All right, on behalf of the University of Washington-Tacoma and the Labor Solidarity Project, I'd like to welcome everyone back for another exciting installment in our Redefining American Labor seminar series. Tonight, joining us is Dr. Michael McCann, who is the Gordon Hirabayashi Professor for the Advancement of Citizenship at the University of Washington, where he's been a faculty member since 1982. He's an original member of the steering committee for the UW Center for Human Rights, and he also served as the director of the Bridges Center for Labor Studies from 2014 to 2018. Dr. McCann's groundbreaking research focuses on politics of rights-based struggles for social justice with an emphasis on challenges to race, gender, and class hierarchies. He's the author of over 60 article-length publications and 8 books, including Rights at Work, Pay Equity Reform and the Politics of Legal Mobilization, and Distorting the Law, a little play on words there, which I appreciated, Politics, Media, and the Litigation Crisis, which he co-authored with William Haltom. His most recent book, and by most recent, I mean published within the last month, which he co-authored with George Lovell, is entitled Union by Law, Filipino American Labor Activists, Rights, Radicalism, and Radical Capitalist Empire. That was published by the University of Chicago Press, and this is part of his Zoom-based book tour. Union by Law, I got a chance to grab a sneak preview of it. It provides a socio-legal analysis of the really century-long battle waged by Filipino workers in the Western US as they struggled for rights and social justice. But I think it's also a story of how law has been deployed to frustrate those struggles to the benefits of the ruling class. I think it really is, in Dr. McCann's own words, an act of recovery that really seeks to set the record straight and tell a history that's shamefully, though I'd say predictably, marginalized within our larger national narrative. So Dr. Michael McCann, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Great, thank you much for inviting me. This is a treat to talk to people in the series. I actually had a hand in the Bridges Center in funding this series, which is great. It was a no-brainer. I think it's a great idea, and we've been trying to encourage these things. We haven't been able to do that in past years, but this year, because we received some state funding to expand the mission of the Bridges Center, we could do that. Unfortunately, I feel that we are in jeopardy of losing that funding because of what's going on. But let's hope that that doesn't happen. Okay, so and it's nice to have all of you here. I'm glad that people are paying attention to issues of labor, and especially essential workers, low-wage labor. That's always an important issue in the American legacy and racial capitalist legacy. But it certainly take on particular meanings at this moment, given the perilous situation of so many workers. Who are either unemployed or employed in very dangerous ways and having to try and navigate those complicated situations. So I'm not going to directly talk about the current period now, but hopefully some of what I say is relevant. So maybe we'll have a chance to apply or connect what it is I'm saying to current issues when I'm done. And what I'm going to do is, as Alex said, thank you, Alex, for inviting me. I'm going to talk about this book that just came out. It's a book that I began in 1997, researched for a couple of years and then dropped for about 12 years, and then began researching again in 2010 and 11 with a big National Science Foundation grant, and it's taken forever. And a co-author, George Lovell, who began as a co-author in 2010 and then dropped out because he became a Harry Bridges chair and then a chair of political science department, and he's now divisional dean, and he just couldn't do it. But he's been a very important intellectual force. He's a close friend, and he's been involved in much of the kind of political activism that gave rise to this. So I do need to give him due credit. Okay, so I have a PowerPoint. It's kind of a detailed PowerPoint. And let's see if we can get it up here. Let me flip this. Can everybody see that okay? Is that good? Okay, so this is the book. It just came out. I just received my copies a couple of days ago. It's a book you really need to have because it's a big book. It's 500 pages and it's very heavy. And if you need like a paperweight, or something like that. It works really, really well. But it's a book that I have been thinking about for a long period of time. It's gone through lots of changes to this final stage. And it's called Union by Law, which means a variety of different things. It's a union that unions are both constructed by law, but it's also unions are outside of law, challenging law, working with law, fighting law on legal. It's about contestation on legal terrain. And the focus is Filipino American labor activists, rights radicalism, because their agenda of migrant workers was what I call radical rights, embracing liberal rights and turning them to more radical transformative causes in the context of racial capitalism. I'll talk a little bit about racial capitalism, but people may have some questions about that concept and why I chose to use that. And okay, so just merge right in. So the book kind of provides a window into the last 100 years of minority worker experience in the United States, and especially the experience of subjugation by law, but also the attempts to use law and especially legal principles and rights ideas, sense of entitlement to challenge existing legal arrangements and hierarchical arrangements at work and in society to try and transform the society around us. So it's a 100-year social history. It's a history that's full of contestation. Filipino workers from the very beginning began to contest their racialized, marginalized status, to fight not only for citizenship and entry into the American regime, but also to change that story. And that'll become apparent as I talk. It's a lot about law, but it's not just official law. I'll talk a lot about court battles and court decisions, but it's really much more about workers embracing principles of rights and challenging existing structures of power in society, in the workplace, more broadly in society, in challenging capitalism by taking rights, which is a very traditional liberal concept, and making it do some radical work. So it's a kind of more, it's a different conception of law than we usually talk about, although it's one that's been part of all of my work and is very familiar in what we call socio-legal studies. I will talk about in the context of changing relations of racial capitalism, which I'll define in a moment. One of the themes is going to be that for every struggle that's produced some advance for workers, there's always a backlash. There's always setbacks for workers. We have been in the last 30 years in a major setback, and that's where I'm going to end my story. And one of the questions is whether we are in a period where there might be new advances for workers given the crisis, the onset of the pandemic. Often moments of crisis like depression, for example, or the Cold War, become opportunities for challenging existing sets of relations and making claims for transforming those relations. I don't have an answer for that. We might talk about that at the end, about now. And it's intended to be a critical counter-narrative to the dominant story about law, and especially about the promise that America has a liberal constitutional legal order, because one of the things that is central to this book is we actually have multiple legal orders, one for white property owning people and another for racialized, unwaged, low-wage, and gendered workers, and who get a different kind of law, a different kind of legal treatment. It's not just they're left out of the liberal constitutional order. There actually is a legal order that's specifically targeted towards them to keep them out of the dominant order. Okay, that all probably sounds very abstract right now, but I will try and make it a little bit more concrete and real by history. So the beginning premise of the book is that law exists to enforce institutional relations and ideology of racial capitalist inequality. The core is the status of property in the American constitutional tradition, and generally in liberal constitutional traditions everywhere in Europe and in colonial and post-colonial orders around the world. Is Karl Marx recognized in his classic essay on the Jewish question that the basic right at the heart of constitutional order is the right to own property. The right to own property, to accumulate profit, and to generate inequality within society. The right of equal participation is a right to be unequal. As James Madison, one of the the most important founder of the American Constitution, wrote in Federalist Paper number 10, the first object, not one of the things the new government's trying to do, but the first object of the new government, the new constitutional order, is to protect the different and unequal faculties for acquiring property. The different and unequal faculties for acquiring property. So from the very beginning, property was to be protected, and that was going to produce inequality, to sustain inequality, and set in motion perpetual inequality throughout American history. Inequality of valuation based on commodification, exchange relations of capitalism. That was just what the framers of the Constitution said. There's no mystique about it. At the same time, not everyone in American society even gets the basic rights under the Constitution, the basic rights to citizenship and the thin rights of equality and the rights to own property. From the very beginning, there has been another tradition which we call repressive law. You see this term, that's our category, although we draw on some other traditions of scholarship to call it repressive law. It is a form of law that has been targeted at the racialized underclass. The basic understanding is that capital accumulation has always depended on an unwaged and low-waged labor force. Unwaged being slavery, low wage meaning the slaves who left and then worked wage jobs afterwards, but unwaged domestic social reproduction, unwaged workers of all kinds. Capital accumulation is always dependent on that. And the workers in those categories tend to get a different kind of law. If the law of liberal law is for property owners that protects contract and exchange relations, commercial acquisition, profit making, and privacy, the law that's targeted towards racialized workers tends to be much more violent, tends to be much less focused on due process and equal protection, much less about protecting rights of exchange and contract, and much more about what we might call order management, which is controlling and disciplining the labor power that's necessary for low-cost labor for capital accumulation and profit development. So, and that's central to the argument I want to make, is that we have a dual legal system. Now that's too simple. We actually have a more complex set of legal orders on a continuum from liberal legal order for property owners to rightsless or semi-rightsless low-wage workers. So it's not simply a dual system. It is really more of a hybrid system. And I can talk about that if you have questions. And the question is, we have this dual system, is people that are subjected to repressive law, in other words, unwaged and low-wage workers, slaves, African Americans under Jim Crow, migrant workers, women, can they embrace the promise of equality in the legal order, that all people are equal under the law, and then after the Civil War, that everybody has equal protection? Can they effectively embrace those ideals to challenge and change the inequality sustained by racial capitalism? That's the puzzle of almost all my work in my adult career as a scholar, is in what ways can those legal ideals and principles and legal institutions and legal tactics be used to challenge the inequalities that are built in, that are baked into our very system. And in particular, I'm interested in Filipinos who managed to embrace the promises of liberal rights, the rights simply to citizenship and citizen equality, and turn those into more transformative resources for pushing America to a more egalitarian, social justice-oriented order, and one that was actually anti-racist, anti-imperialist, and at least a transformed capitalism, if not post-capitalism. That's the puzzle at this book, because that's what Filipino activists were trying to do. I'm trying to understand, how did that happen? Where did that come from? And they were not alone in doing that, but that's the story. And the premise of this goes to Walter Johnson, who wrote a very interesting essay a couple of years ago about Cedric Robinson, a very important scholar on racial capitalism. He said, if we want to understand rights, we don't begin with people who have rights, with property owners. We begin with the people who have been rightsless, the people who have been deprived of rights. We begin with the enslaved. We begin with the low-wage migrant workers who do not have full rights, and we try and understand what rights are and how they matter and how they work from that perspective. And the book is very much in that spirit. We're looking at people who began as essentially rightsless in American history and then fought for rights, not just rights to belong, not just rights to become part of the American order, but rights who would actually challenge and try and transform that order. That's the story we're going to tell. Okay, so this has all been kind of abstract. Let me put some historical meat on this. The book is 100-year social history. It begins with the U.S. invasion of the Philippines in 1898. The Philippines had been subject to Spanish colonial rule for several hundred years prior to 1898, and the Filipinos were continuing to resist that rule and engaged in a war with the Spanish. And the Americans stepped in to side with the Filipinos against the Spanish and to essentially liberate the Filipinos, the Philippine polity and the Philippine population from Spanish rule. The assumption among Filipinos was that then the Philippines would be liberated, just like the Americans broke from the English colonial domination. The Philippines could now become self-governing people, establish their own constitutional order, and the Filipinos would be free under the terms of their own self-governance. But it didn't work out that way. Didn't work out that way because once the Americans entered into the Philippines, fought off the Spanish, they didn't liberate the Philippines. They instead subjected them to colonial domination. They made the Philippines a colony of the United States. This is a period where Americans were colonizing not only Philippines, but Hawaii, and toying with various projects of colonizing islands in the Caribbean, Cuba and Dominican Republic. They each have their own individual histories and work out differently. But the Philippines is the most sort of classic model of colonial domination. And this is an extension of settler capitalism in the US. Settler capitalism simply meaning that America was built around westward expansion, whereby the US government invited white Northern Europeans to come and gave them land and said, you can have land, turn land into property and property into profits, but you need to protect it yourselves. And we will clear the land of indigenous people, and we will provide minimal protection, but turn this into capital. That's a very simple story, but that's where we begin the book, as the colonial project was followed up where that ended. And the problem was that the westward expansion kind of came to an end by the late 19th century. There wasn't a lot more land to develop, and that the future of capital development was limited. So there was increasing inclination to go global, to become a global colonial power, as opposed to a settler capitalist colonial power. And the Philippines was one of the places where that happened. When the Americans entered into the Philippines, there was huge division among dominant elites within the American government. Some were primarily driven by profit. They wanted to take the land and the resources, the very rich resources of fruit and vegetable production, among others, and take it over, reorganize it, and turn it into commodity export for profit. There were others who were very concerned because the Filipinos were viewed as an inferior people, and then that mixing with the Filipinos would actually undercut, undermine, dilute American white racial supremacy. And that existed from the beginning, and that's been part of the whole history of the experience with the Philippines. So part of the rhetoric of colonial domination was that of brutal repression, was that Filipinos are incapable of governing themselves. They're not disciplined, they're not rational, they're not experienced in democratic government, all other kinds of other tropes identified with a long history of racial categorization in the US are oversexed, etc. And they had to be brutally repressed. There was strong resistance by the very forces in the Philippines that were fighting against the Spanish, then turned on the US, which was seen as just a new colonial force, which it was. And there were many years of battle between Filipinos, the local Philippine population, rebels against American rule. In that process, about 1 million Filipinos died, about 40% of them through direct combat, but many others through the fallout from war and disease and the other dislocations that brutal war bring. So one of the rhetorics was, we have to conquer and we have to subjugate because these people can't govern themselves. It was very similar to much of the European colonial projects. But the other language was that of uplift, was that what Americans were going to do, this was the more inspiring language of American colonialism. We are going to civilize these people. We are going to bring them self-government, but it's going to take generations or at least decades so that we can teach them the arts of self-government so they can become an independent people who own property individually, and then who also have the capacity for self-government. And so that was a big part of the American self-identification. When I say American, I mean the white property-owning dominant, elite population of America. And it was, and this cartoon captures that whole bit. Here we have Uncle Sam in a classroom, and he is tutoring people into how to be independent property owners, self-governing, disciplined, and capable of self-government. Here you actually see the 4 of the targets of colonial rule: Cuba, Dominican Republic, and the Philippines, because this was a project that extended beyond the Philippines, including to Hawaii at the time. And that's what this cartoon captures. There's, you can't read this up here, but this is all about that dominion and subjugation is actually the path to civilization. That's essentially what this says, even though you can't read it. So is it just, we are doing this for you, so that we're going to liberate you? Is this going to take 40 or 50 or 100 years, whatever? You see other people here that have been part of that subjugation project. You see a Native American here who is reading a book upside down to underline the fact that Native Americans are uncivilized and incapable of governing themselves. You see an African American in a menial job here cleaning the windows, again underlining that this is part of an overall racial capitalist project. This is a project about bringing capitalism and civilization to differently situated people who were all inferior and incapable of ruling themselves. And that was the way in which this whole project was imagined. And it was very divisive. There were a lot of opponents of this in American society, including Mark Twain and the anti-colonial forces at the time. But nevertheless, the primary debate among American elites was, well, we should subordinate them because there's a lot of money to be made by taking over all their land and turning that into profit. But the danger is that we are going to bring Filipinos or these different races into the American project, and we're actually going to contaminate the white race. That was the dominant ideological discussion of the time. I have a question from Ashley. Pulicano, yes, I'm going to talk about Pulicano. I can talk about him in a moment. Challenge alien land laws. I'll get to that in a moment. That's a little bit ahead of the game. Cartoon said it was from Harper's. Harper's was a major national magazine. I should say at this time, in the 1890s and early 20th century, this is the first time we have national magazines, the national media that develops, that kind of constructs the idea of American identity and America's place in the world. Prior to this, most magazines and newspapers have been very local and very diffuse and decentralized. Who are these people in the back? Somebody asked. I don't know who they are. Well, first of all, you see a bunch of women, because women are another group that's incapable of self-government and can't be given full rights and has to be subjected to tutelage of men. So that's the first thing I'd say. I could give like an hour-and-a-half lecture on this whole thing, but I can't do that right now. But you get the picture I'm getting at. I'll get to the West Coast, the questions in a second. Okay, so what happens is when America takes over the Philippines, they create a new constitutional order, which is it looks a little bit like the American Constitution, but it's very different in that it lodges most of the authority in the executive branch, which is run by white Americans, and secondarily by mestizo Spanish mixed race elites in the Philippines. But it almost totally excludes working people, the many different ethnic groups within the Philippines. It is a very centralized and elitist government, and that's a whole story in itself. But it leads to governing problems over the next century. That's like I said, a different story. But if somebody wants to ask about that, I can explain. But it creates a rather dysfunctional government that's very unrepresentative, very undemocratic, but it facilitates working with American corporate capital to take over and transform the Philippines into export capitalism. So what happened is, did I miss something here? No, okay, I'm good. Is that many of the Filipinos, especially in the north, were peasants. They worked off of land that was owned by and supervised by the Spanish Catholic Church. But they had a fair degree of self-sufficiency. They worked off the land, they decided how they were going to work, they had freedom as producers, and they mostly produced for self-sufficiency, but also for local exchange. They would trade, products with each other and barter systems, and they had a simple monetized economy. But there's a certain degree of freedom in the peasant lifestyle. They were not affluent, they were not rich, and so forth, but they did have a certain kind of control over their lives. But as a result of American corporations coming in under the new constitutional government, most of those peasants were displaced from the land. The land was reorganized and reorganized along the lines of plantation capitalism, really based on the slave model of plantations. Huge productive enterprises, centrally owned, controlled by banks and financiers, and they were highly segregated in terms of the workforce. So that the local Filipinos, who traditionally had been peasants, were now turned into proletarian workers, working in very harsh conditions for very low wages, very unhealthy and safe work conditions, with no capacity to really build capital of their own, either individually or collectively. The communal experience that they had known as peasants was basically shattered. And they were turned into a racialized proletariat, essentially. Many of those workers in this new subjugated position were then conscripted to come work in the West Coast of the United States. Once they're turned into low-wage workers, exploited workers, Americans said, well, why don't we bring them and work in the US? There had already been several generations of low-wage workers. There had been slaves, and then there had been agricultural workers, mostly under Jim Crow in the South. But on the West Coast, there had been three waves of Asian migrant workers. The first were Chinese that came in the 1870s and 1880s, and then Japanese that began to be imported in the 1890s and early 2000s, and then the third wave was Filipinos. The first two waves, Chinese and Japanese, were brought in because they were necessary to low-wage work, agricultural work, work in salmon canneries, domestic work, but they were feared, they were resented, and they were hated because of their racial characteristic, because of the racialization, that they were inferior, and the danger was that they were going to pollute white American racial quality. And the same thing happened to Filipinos. Filipinos were conscripted, which is to say they were recruited to come to America. And again, these are many people who were displaced from their land, had terrible jobs, were poor, and were sold stories. You can have an opportunity in America to come work in the agricultural fields of the West Coast, or to come work in Alaskan salmon canneries, which is a booming industry in the early 20th century, doing various kinds of domestic work in the off seasons. So a significant number of Filipino migrants came to the West Coast. Many of them went to Hawaii, which was another colonized land. I think there are maybe up to 30,000 Filipinos who ended up in Hawaii, but another 10 to 12, 15,000 went on to the West Coast. And a lot of these migrant workers were migrant in the sense that they were migrating from the Philippines to the West Coast to Hawaii. They were constantly in circulation. They were also seasonal workers. So they were migrating because they worked in the agricultural fields of California and Washington State in part of the year, and then they would go work in the salmon canneries during the other part of the year to slice up fish and turn that into canned salmon. I'll get to that in a moment. So this is a migratory force in many kinds of ways. Of those who came, Filipinos who came to the US, Americans had a real problem. They had to figure out, where are we going to place these people in the American racial imagination? Because Americans pretty much had a binary of black and white, but that had been complicated by the introduction of two previous waves of Asians, Chinese and Japanese, and also Mexicans. So we have entry into the black-white racial imagination. We now have yellow and we have brown. Where do we put Filipinos? They're obviously not white Americans, but where do we put them? And essentially what happened is they became blackened. And the reason for that is that they had been educated in American colonial schools. Unlike Chinese and Japanese, they spoke English because they'd been educated in English. They'd been educated in American history. They dressed like Americans, and I'll show you some pictures in a moment. They dressed in American dress. They spoke American, they knew America, so they were not like the other waves of Asians. They were much more like African Americans in Jim Crow South. Spoke English, dressed American, knew America, but they were a subjugated, racialized, laboring class. You know, it's more complicated than that, but and you can ask questions, but I'll try and after we get through a while. And their status in the new land was they were not citizens because they were colonial subjects. They were subjects of the colonial Philippines. And a whole new legal category was created specifically for Filipinos and then for some of the other members of other colonial regimes, and it was colonial nationals. They did not have rights as citizens. They were essentially rightsless. But nevertheless, they were not the same as aliens. They were not complete outsiders. They were not like some of the, for example, Mexican workers that came who were aliens. Colonial nationals is this new kind of intermediate category. And a lot of what happens in the early period is, what kind of rights do they have? What kind of rights do they not have? What can they do? Who are they? But they were heavily racialized, constructed as inferior mentally, emotionally, and all that. They were constructed as very oversexed. So they had this kind of unique status. But the unique, and you can see this in the early 20th century, there are these expositions that became very popular in America. There are expositions of people in the world. And these expositions, well, there's one in Seattle and there's one in Portland, but there's important ones in Philadelphia and Chicago, all in the early part of the century. And they would have all these villages of different people in the world. And the whole point was to establish a racial hierarchy in the world, a racial hierarchy in the world. And so each village would kind of characterize the racial progress of each group. And there are gross distortions. You can see this was a poster for the Philippine Exposition, which doesn't look like any Filipinos who came to the US. But nevertheless, they were characterized as very primitive Africans, even though that's grossly misleading about who they were. Or the Igorot was one of the ethnic groups in the southern Philippines, and they were portrayed as very primitive. Spear throwers, monkey eaters, dog eaters, all these kind of very negative things. And this is a way of characterizing the new Filipino population as dangerous, as problematic, and so forth, even though the Filipinos who came were actually from the northern Philippines and were educated and were a very different group of people. Anyhow, so the rightsless colonial nationals. The other legal problem or complexity here is that while Filipinos did not have citizenship rights, so they didn't have, and citizenship meaning the rights to have other rights. They couldn't own property, they couldn't intermarry, they didn't have rights to privacy, and so forth. Under the 14th Amendment, which is one of the 3 amendments passed after the Civil War, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, all persons are guaranteed due process and equal protection. Not all citizens, but all persons. So Filipinos, migrant workers, found themselves in this kind of liminal space, this indeterminate legal status between rightsless colonial nationals and people with rights under the 14th Amendment. And over the next 30 or 40 years, lots and lots of legal battles were fought over entitlements of Filipino nationals between those two poles of rightsless status and a kind of uncertain rights status under the 14th Amendment. Okay. The other aspect of Filipino racialization was that they were deemed repeatedly to be criminals. Filipinos were, it's a familiar trope of American history, and some of you are probably know this, will understand it, but to racialize people is to deem them as less than citizens, to be undisciplined, not self-governed, to be extremely violent, to be very volatile, to be overly sexed, and to be inherently a criminal population. And that was done, that was a stigmatized category placed on Filipinos, just like it was the Chinese and Japanese, the Hispanic Americans, Mexicans who worked low-wage workers, and African Americans certainly before them. and they were criminalized, which is to say that they were existentially criminalized. Had nothing to do with what they did. It's not for criminal behavior, but they were inherently criminal by their very identity and their cultural makeup. And as a result of that, between the fact that they were deemed to be violent and undisciplined and dangerous, they were subjected to brutal repression by owners of the means of production, farms, salmon canneries, other forms of production, the capitalist owners, by representatives of the state, local law enforcement, sheriffs and police, and also the FBI. I'll get to some of the stories of FBI in a moment, and by the broader white society. The Filipinos were seen to be a great danger that had to be subjected by very repressive means, what I call repressive law. Repressive law was that form of law that from the very beginning, going back to before the constitutional period, developed to control racialized underclass, especially to begin with African Americans who were slaves, and then other subsequent populations, low-wage racialized populations. Carlos Bulasan, who wrote one of the most important insights into the early Filipino experience. He was a Filipino worker who grew up in the Philippines and then migrated to the US and then became a novelist and a poet, and is amazing. If you ever a chance to read Carlos Bulasan, I strongly urge you to read him. And we use Bulasan in the first half of the book a lot as an insight into the experience of Filipino workers. In his very famous lines, he writes, "I feel like I'm a criminal running away from a crime I did not commit. And this crime is that I am a Filipino in America." In other words, to be a Filipino in America is to be a criminal. No matter what you do, it has nothing to do with behavior. It is an existential status. It is what we often talk about now as a status crime. Just the way that many immigrants and refugees are, by the very nature of their status, viewed as criminal. Not because anything they did was criminal or dangerous or harmful to society, but they are criminals by their very situation. And Filipinos are very aware of that. There's a picture of Carlos Bulasan in the 1950s, I think. That's the cover to his book. I strongly recommend anybody read it. If you want to understand it about the migrant worker experience in the US, not just Filipinos, but others, it's an amazing book. And we use it a lot in our book to make sense of things. And this is an example. This is what happened. Filipino workers, like other migrant workers, Asian workers, Chinese and Japanese before them, Mexican workers, were needed for capital accumulation because they provided cheap and almost free labor. But they weren't wanted. They were hated for racial reasons because they threatened the purity of the white dominant class. And that's been always the paradox of American immigrant workers, the low-wage workers who are needed in America for their low-wage work for capital accumulation, but not wanted because of their purported racial characteristics. And this is just a picture in a 1929 newspaper in Seattle that shows Filipinos keep out. That sign, Filipinos keep out, was all over the place in Seattle, in the Puget Sound area, in Washington State. It often said Filipinos and dogs keep out because Filipinos were often likened to be animals like dogs, something less than subhuman, a very racialized, dehumanizing sort of characterization. Let me stop. Let me see if anybody has questions. So, well, let me go a little bit more. Yeah, look, I'll stop for a second, see if people have questions or comments about the early experience of Filipinos. I want to talk about their organizing to win rights. Oh, Michael Honey's here. Hi, Michael. How you doing? Absolutely. Read Bulasan for a view of West Coast racism, including Seattle. Okay. So on one hand, while Filipino workers were subjected to repressive law, to white racism, they were brutalized in all kinds of ways. They were deported routinely, which is a form of terror, or at least a threat of deportation is a form of terror. They were confined to working in labor concentration camps, which are very much like other kinds of concentration camps. They were routinely beat up. They were lynched. They were harassed and surveilled, subjected to all kinds of brutality by white owners of production, by white citizens in society, often by white local police and sheriffs, and at certain moments we'll see even by national law enforcement officials like FBI and so forth. And so the racism was actually not just hate, it was actually manifest in violence that was legitimated and defended and protected by law. That's what we talk about as repressive law. Repressive law just doesn't brutalize people, it actually permits the brutalization by other people, by whites in society, including white workers who felt very threatened by these low-wage workers with the allegation that they were competing for jobs, even though that was not the case. If there was a danger to Filipino workers, is that they were demanding equal wages to the wages of white workers. Anyhow, that's another story. Okay, but Filipinos did not just put up with this sort of becoming targets of racial subjugation and class subjugation. From the very beginning, they began to fight for rights in a variety of ways. So early in the book, we detail a couple of different kinds of accounts. One was that Filipinos in World War I, the very earliest Filipinos who came in 1915, 1916, signed up, enlisted for military service. And they did that specifically, said, if we fight for you in World War I, will you give us citizenship rights? Because citizenship is, after all, the pathway to other kinds of rights, to property ownership and to access to jobs and access to capital and to privacy and due process and so forth. And they fought that in courts over and over and over again. Many of them went to fight in World War I, came back, and they were denied rights of citizenship. So they fought that in court, and they won a lot of those cases. That was one site in the pillars of racial exclusion, which they had a lot of success. Can't talk about specifics. Second one has to do with property ownership and property leasing. Filipinos were prohibited from owning property. And this is important because, and they fought a lot of battles over this because they wanted to own property. And sometimes that's interpreted as they wanted to become part of capitalist America, but I think that's really wrong, really misleading. What they wanted to do was to own property so that they could organize production much more along the lines that they were familiar with in the Philippine experience. So they could develop communal farms where they collectively owned and collectively worked and develop cooperatives so that they could produce an alternative form of production that was much less alienating, much less brutal, and much freer than the kind of production that they were subjected to as low-wage workers in the agricultural fields and the salmon canneries. So they wanted to own property, but they were prohibited from owning property. So they became very clever in some ways. One thing they did was that they, some of the most fertile land in Washington state was in the Yakima Indian Reservation. And so they began to work with the Indians to develop leasing programs. So if they couldn't own the property, they would lease the program and develop their own farms collectively and cooperatives collectively to sort of work out their non-capitalist form of work organization or production. Many of them were prosecuted because they saw that that was a kind of a ruse that they were not supposed to be doing, but they did it covertly. Another ruse that they used was Filipinos would marry native women or white women, both of whom were allowed to own property. And that way the Filipinos could participate in ownership of property and develop these alternative forms of production. And they fought a whole bunch of legal battles and they eventually won. Somebody mentioned Pio Decano earlier, who was a labor contractor who owned property and was told that he couldn't own property. And it's a complex story, I won't get into it, but he won a major court decision that granted him the right to own property. And that opened up, this, not the floodgates, but it opened up the rights of property for Filipinos generally in this period. This was in the 1930s. And then another pillar of racial hierarchy was the prohibition on racial intermarriage and racial intermixing generally between Filipinos and white women in particular. Filipinos, one of the fears that was raised repeatedly by white men was that Filipino men were cavorting with and having sex with and even trying to marry white women. And that's, again, this is a big threat of racial pollution, that this was going to destroy the white race. Across the country, in most states in America, there were anti-miscegenation laws that prohibited racial intermixing. That began with African Americans, but it also extended to Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, and then the Filipinos. And Filipinos fought battles against that. In California, they fought a number of really creative legal cases. And the way that they won those cases was they said that all the anti-miscegenation statutes characterized that they applied to African Americans and to Asian Americans. And they cleverly argued that they weren't Asian Americans, playing on the fact that their racialization by dominant white population, they weren't Asian, they were some other kind of race. And they won that. And they managed to diffuse California anti-miscegenation laws to exclude Filipinos. They also fought in Washington state against efforts to even pass anti-miscegenation laws. And Washington state was one of the few states in the country in the 20s and 30s that didn't even have, that never successfully passed anti-miscegenation laws. One of the reasons why Seattle and Washington state became a haven for Filipinos was that Filipinos didn't have to worry about being excluded from racial intermixing. And that was also true for African Americans as well. That's part of the Seattle legacy. We can talk about that. Okay, so they fight these early battles, and they're fighting in the courts, but they're fighting all over. They're fighting for rights struggles everywhere. They're fighting in the streets. They're mobilizing protests. They're fighting in the mass media. They're fighting in all kinds of fronts. So these weren't just narrowly legal judicial struggles, although courts were often involved. These were broad-based struggles for what I call legal mobilization. This all accelerated to some degree in the 1920s and 1930s. The 1920s, Filipino workers, migrant workers, Filipino American, you could say almost at that point, began to organize into unions. They did that by affiliating with pre-existing unions, with unions that existed up and down the West Coast, and also some national unions like Lukapawa. And these are usually non-white unions, because the AFL was a Jim Crow organization for the most part that refused to allow workers of color. So they were all white unions. And so they had to organize their own kinds of unions. And one of the things that we try and demonstrate was that among all the different ethnic workers, Chinese, Japanese, Hispanic, Latino, African Americans, the Filipinos were most committed to multiracial unions. Their whole idea was, we have to bring people of all races together if we're going to challenge capital. And they were not entirely successful with that, but that was one of the organizing logics. And they had probably more success than anybody else on the West Coast in promoting that kind of multiracial union organizing effort. Anyway, from the 1920s through the 1930s, Filipino workers organized in affiliations with a variety of different unions. There were at least 12 transitions in the unions that they affiliated with and that they generated and that they led and then they left. It's a very complicated period, and they ended up in the ILWU Local 37 in 1950. ILWU was very, very important to this early history of the Filipino workers, because ILWU was one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful union in the country, precisely because ILWU, which were dock workers who controlled, who participated in shipping of goods and services in ports around the country, that's a lot of power. If they struck and shut down a port, that kind of shut down the country, and that gave them a lot of power. And for various reasons, ILWU, under the leadership of Harry Bridges, I'm sure you probably heard various things about Harry Bridges, allied with very closely the Filipino workers. Why that is, that's a complicated story. I'm not even sure I fully understand. I mean, I could give some explanations, but it doesn't matter here. But the Filipinos began to organize very effectively. The other thing that happened was the Filipino workers threw in with a lot of radical workers on the West Coast. The West Coast had its own distinctive radical history of communists, socialists, the Wobblies initially, anarchists, and it was a very vibrant tradition of worker organization around left causes, and that many of the Filipinos, especially the leaders, some who were the more educated, became very close to the various radical wings of labor organizing on the West Coast. Many of them became self-professed communists, and this becomes a problem later on that I'll get to in a minute. So the unions are left unions, and they're very committed, again, to anti-racism, to anti-imperialism, and to transforming, if not overrunning, capitalism. They, and again, the point I want to make is we often tell immigrant stories that immigrants want to join America and become part of America and assimilate. And that's certainly true for part of the Filipino population. But a significant part of the Filipino population, especially those that are involved in this organizing of unions and advocacy, they don't want to just join the racial capitalist order. They want to change the racial capitalist order. And that was part of their entire political orientation that begins to develop in the 1920s and 1930s. And the interesting thing is they imagine this in terms of the logic of rights. What our book is about, how they employed the resources of liberal rights, rights to equal citizenship, that would coexist with rights to property. And in the Marxist sense, rights of equal citizenship were always subordinated to property rights, but they wanted to turn those rights of equal citizenship, the promises of equality, against the kinds of hierarchies and devaluations that were implicit in the capitalist, racial capitalist order. They wanted to turn equality against racism, against capitalist profit hierarchy, and against imperialism. And this ideology develops in the 20s and 30s. And it's complex to try and figure out why and how it did, but nevertheless, if you want to ask questions about that, I can try and do that. Yeah, you're Michael Honey. Mentioned certainly that Harry Bridges married a Japanese American woman. And Harry was very close to the Filipinos, and there's a variety of reasons why that happened or how that happened, but it certainly was part of the history. So here's an early salmon cannery, Asian worker. It's not actually a Filipino worker, but you see that. And what was important to the salmon canneries was that they were organized on an 18th, 19th century plantation model, the same model of slave production in an earlier period that for unwaged African-American slaves. It was a hierarchical system that was racially segregated in terms of jobs, in terms of living quarters, in terms of food, in terms of everything. The Asians, three waves of Asians, first the Chinese and the Japanese and the Filipinos, were all confined. They were conscripted for and confined to the production line jobs. The low-wage jobs that were very unsafe, very unhealthy. People routinely would be hurt very badly. They would lose fingers and lose hands. They would be subject to all this sort of unsanitary conditions of fish everywhere, and with very little medical care. And they lived in their own quarters and ate subpar food, whereas the white workers were eligible for higher paying jobs in lower middle management. They lived in better quarters, usually individual houses. It was completely segregated. You can see this machine here. It's called the iron chink. The iron chink was a machine that developed around 1910 or so to speed up production mechanically that had been done originally by Chinese. That's why it's called the iron chink, which is, of course, is a racial categorization. And what it did was, by introducing machinery, it sped up production of slicing and dicing salmon and making them available for canning. And canning was a very profitable industry in the early part of the century. And in fact, through the Vietnam War, because it was one of the primary foods that was used for the American military, World War I, World War II, Korea, through Vietnam. And so it was a profitable industry. And it depended on mass production. And it was the workers on the line that really paid the price, who sacrificed their lives and their health to make this system work. And that was a system, well, you'll see, continues on really into the 1970s. These were early cannery workers. I mentioned before, the cannery workers and the Filipinos, on one hand, were obviously not American, but they worked very hard to look American. They were educated in American schools. They dressed like Americans. They combed their hair like Americans. They wore suits. They spoke good English, and they knew American history and traditions. As Carlos Bulasan said at one point, they knew America better than Americans did, meaning white Americans. And that distinguished them from the earlier waves of immigrant workers, and also from Mexican migrant workers as well. The ideology of rights that they developed is a sort of taking rights, liberal rights, and turning it against racism, imperialism, and capitalism. There's no better textbook. And we spend a whole chapter just analyzing the 1952 ILWU Local 37 yearbook. This was edited by Carlos Bulasan, who I mentioned earlier, the literary chronicler of their experience. And he wrote many of the essays, and he puts a lot of his ideas about not just how to join America, but how to challenge America to work in this 1952 yearbook. And I can't talk about that much, but if you want to see examples of what liberal rights discourse looks like, turn to A Radical Causes. That's the place you look. You can read chapter 3 of our book, all about that. Okay, let me stop, see if there's any questions at the moment. Where did the idea of racial pollution came from? Well, the idea of racial pollution, I think, was around in America from the very beginning, just like it was in Europe. As Europeans engaged in colonial projects around the world, in the global South, and began to go into Africa, into Latin America, into Asia, to subjugate populations, to provide labor for for capital accumulation, and began to take land and other resources for capital accumulation. There was always this fear in Europe about polluting the white race. And that was handed down and recirculated in America as well. There's a lot in the book about different elites in America saying, okay, we should do this colonial project because we're going to make money, we're going to expand our power, military power, because now we're going to have, the Philippines is very important as a port on the way to sell products in Asia, but also for extending military power. That becomes important after World War I into World War II. So on one hand, there were benefits from colonial project, but the danger was that Americans were going to undermine white supremacy. This very strong view that's been in America from the beginning, just as it was in Europe, that white people are the superior race. Intellectually, morally, emotionally, religiously, are superior race. And interaction with inferior peoples, racially inferior people, is going to pollute that. And that was the big danger about Filipinos, because white women tended to like, at least a lot of the evidence is that there are a lot of white women liked hanging out with Filipino men. And that was incredibly scary to a white patriarchal culture because it was undercutting, what was perceived to be racial purity. But that's an old story. Is that available versus the Bridges Center? I'm not sure what the question was there from Alex. What's the question? What was available from the Bridges Center?
Sorry, I was just curious to know if that the yearbook you were just plugging.
Yes, you can find it. Almost much of our data come from the archives of the University of Washington Special Collections, and the yearbook. There's a copy of the yearbook in the UW Special Collections in the libraries. You can find it online if you go to. If you go into the University of Washington Special Collections and just plug in 1952 Local 37 yearbook, you can get access to the entire yearbook. Or you can read chapter 3 of our book, where we spend a great deal of time talking about the various essays and the sort of ideology of radical rights that emerges from that period of time. Okay. So yeah, get to the 1930s. That was an important moment for workers because the New Deal, Wagner Act provided opportunities and rights for organization, although it was primarily for white industrial workers. But Filipinos were very clever in redefining much of their work as industrial. Fruit packing and vegetable packing, which a lot of Filipinos were doing, was not an agricultural enterprise, it was an industrial enterprise. The salmon canning was an industrial enterprise. These various kinds of extraction work, which originally were really excluded from the logic of the New Deal, now were protected. So they gained greater rights to organize and to empower themselves. And the other thing that was really important for Filipinos was World War II. Just like in World War I, many Filipinos enlisted to fight in World War II against the Japanese, which is partly in part because the Japanese had attacked the Philippines, and with the promise of that if they fought for the US in that battle, they would gain political rights to citizenship and equality, even though those rights were not really realized for many people for decades after that, after a lot of court battles. But that was a fundamental transformation. And one of the things that happened was a change in the whole status of the Philippines, that the Philippines, which was once seen as this inferior, dependent, colonial polity, now won sort of status for being part of the war effort to defeat the Japanese and all that. But as soon as that happened, with its empowerment, the organizing, the New Deal, and World War II, immediately the rights that Japanese had won were eviscerated and reduced. And this is one of the stories about, for every gain, there was a series of losses. You have Taft-Hartley, which came along and restricted workers, a number of the rights that had been won with the Wagner Act and the New Deal, including the rights to strike and secondary and solidary strikes, the authorizing states to pass right to work laws, which made unionization very difficult. And then a whole variety of court decisions came along and eviscerated rights of workers. And that affected Filipinos in the new unions in significant ways. It's too complicated to get into here. The other thing that happened was McCarthyism. Is that, as I mentioned before, many of the leaders of the Filipino unions were leftists. They were self-proclaimed, self-professed communists, or at least socialists, certainly politically left. And in the immediate Cold War period after World War II, beginning in the late 1940s, the state cracks down on leftists. And they cracked down in particular on the leaders in Local 37, ILW Local 37 of the Filipino cannery workers. Over 200 of the leaders and activists within the union were threatened with deportation. There were dozens and dozens of trials to try and deport them. And the deportation was not just to get rid of them, but it was to threaten them and to try and intimidate the leaders to moderate their political activism and so forth. But the incredible thing was that Filipino workers, largely supported by John Coughlin, who was an attorney for, communist attorney actually, for the ILWU, and an alliance with Harry Bridges, who himself was subjected to McCarthy purges, and they tried to deport him. He won all of his cases. The Filipinos won every one of their cases. And they managed, no single Filipino of those several hundred that was charged with crimes and efforts to deport was actually left. So that was a big set of victories for them. And there's a lot in the book about that. On the other hand, it ended up crushing the union because all the legal battles fighting to protect these leftist leaders of the union bankrupt the union. The union was left depleted in terms of energy, in terms of money, and many of the workers turned their back on the leaders. And so the state, in some ways, government achieved its ends by repressing the leftist leaders and workers, and what was left was new leaders took over who were much less representative of the workers, much less committed to democratic socialism, and were basically ILW 37 turned into a business union. It was much more responsive to the needs of capital than it was to the workers. And that continued on for the next 20 years in the 1950s and 1960s. I see that I am really running low on time here. So let me just try and summarize with the rest of what I wanted to talk about. The second major of really transformation was in the 1960s. World War II changed the world order in that the Holocaust and genocide that was a product of white supremacy in Europe was recognized as a tragedy that should not be replicated. And so we see a movement towards constitutionalization, the development of rule of law and constitutions with separation of powers, guarantees of rights for all individuals across Europe, and in the US, which already had a constitution and rights of people, an expansion of rights for traditionally subjugated workers of color, and specifically for African Americans. It was that context of the Cold War that provided the possibilities for the triumph of a long-standing civil rights movement that had been sort of developing for many, many decades in the US, but the Cold War provided the moment of triumph. And the reason was quite simple. The Cold War was an ideological war between America that portrayed itself as the land of freedom and equal opportunity versus the Soviet Union, which was the land of repression and lack of freedom. The problem was that Americans' argument that we were the land of freedom and we were trying to build alliances with Africans and with the Latin American, Southeast Asia, that story didn't sell very well because of the legacy of slavery and then continued Jim Crow segregation. So there was huge pressure that developed from the military, from diplomats, from the media to do something about the Southern question of segregation. And that created the context in which you get the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The 1964 Civil Rights Act represented a new legal regime into the workplace for low-wage workers, but specifically for low-wage workers and for women, low-wage workers of color and for women, by providing new resources to fight against discrimination. There were different legal resources in kind because the Wagner Act and the New Deal had provided rights for collective organization and collective bargaining by unions, by workers collectively, whereas the Civil Rights Act offered different resources specifically for individuals to challenge individually discrimination, including challenging unions that traditionally had excluded workers of color, Jim Crow unions, and especially in the building trades, where Blacks and people of color were historically excluded. And this becomes a context in which a second generation, the sons mostly of that first generation of Filipino workers developed, and they developed their own kind of politics. Many of them were still, the second generation worked in the canneries, mostly in the summers, because many of them were college students, but not all of them. That's Jean Viernes, who was one of the workers. And they developed their own kind of new radical politics. And on one hand, was going to replicate the politics of the first generation, but had a distinctive character as a result of the 1960s and early 1970s. Civil rights movement, the post-civil rights, Black radicalism, women's rights and women's liberation movement, Asian American rights movement, and the anti-war movement. And the second generation became caught up in all of this kind of politics, anti-war and post-civil rights radical politics. And a key person here was Tyree Scott. And I'm realizing right now, I don't know why this morning I got this all in an hour, and I'm not going to get close to doing that today. Alex, how long does this class go to?
We're scheduled to end at 7:30.
Okay, I'm going to have to wrap it up then. Anyhow, the second generation, Tyree Scott becomes a critical person, and I think I distributed a reading about Tyree Scott. Tyree Scott was an amazing person. He had fought in Vietnam as a Marine, and he came back to Seattle in the late 1960s, and he tried to get a job as an electrician along with his father. But like other African Americans and people of color, he was excluded from the building trades. They were all white. And he began to organize to do something about that. He developed several organizations, one which was United Construction Workers Association, and he met a lot of these young Filipino workers who were then organized in the Alaskan Cannery Workers Association, and also representatives from United Farm Workers in California up through Washington. And they developed a law firm, and they developed a strategy, which was to protest these forms of exclusion from work and from unions, by all white unions. But to not only protest and to use strategies of street protest, but also to file lawsuits. And Tyree Scott kind of pioneered the strategy of filing lawsuits, but then engaging in street protests, massive protests, media tactics, and so forth, to try and open up unions, but also to break down the discrimination against workers of color in Seattle and the Puget Sound, and then eventually in parts of the South. Tyree Scott was active in at least 24 different sites around the U.S., following the strategy of filing lawsuits and then mobilizing around those lawsuits to organize workers of color. And this became a strategy for the second generation of young Filipino activists. Again, many of whom were planning on going to college. They didn't want to be low-wage workers all their lives, but they were still working in the canneries along with and in the same sites as their fathers, and experiencing the same conditions that their fathers had. Plantation organization, which segregated workers along the lines of the actual jobs they performed, the housing conditions, the food conditions, and prevented them from moving up into better jobs and dealing with the horrendous work conditions. That's Tyree Scott right there by any chance. This is Michael Fox, who was one of the attorneys who was the original founders of the Labor Employment Law Office. That's Selmy Domingo, who is one of the two major leaders. So how am I going to summarize this? This is Tyree. Tyree, again, much of the story has been about law. Tyree had his own sort of view of law. He and Cindy Domingo, who is a sister of Selmy Domingo, got into a battle with one of their lawyers in Lilo once, and he wrote this letter, and this is what he said. We recognize that we have a different view of law from yours. In other words, from a conventional civil rights lawyer. says, we see the law as a set of rules that exist as a result of tug of war, which is a constant between the class that rules and the democratic forces that are ruled. During this ongoing war, both of these forces make gains and losses. We see that law is something that is neither morally right nor stagnant. At any given time, in our view, law reflects the relative strengths and weaknesses of its opponents and proponents. And that's very much how we portray law. Law is a product of struggle, class struggle, of racial struggle, and each moment it reflects who has the greatest power. That doesn't mean that those who are less powerful can't sometimes extract concessions and make gains. And that's the story of the book, is that law generally protects racial capitalism, but at particular moments, under certain opportunities, workers of color have been able to win lawsuits, be able to win struggles over rights in and out of the courts, and been able to advance their causes. And that's what this second generation of workers do. They filed these lawsuits in court under the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and they use those lawsuits not only to try and win in court to change work conditions, but also to win support within their union for throwing out the corrupt and conservative leaders that had taken over in the 1950s and reassert leadership that was now much more democratic, much more progressive, even overtly socialist, and to restore that agenda and to include in that an anti-imperialist agenda of trying to depose Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines. It was a very ambitious struggle that was all catalyzed to some degree by filing lawsuits. And three major events converged in 1989. One of those was that Ferdinand Marcos was pushed out of office, partly because I left out this part. Selmy Domingo and Jean Viernes, who were the leaders of these unions and who were the architects, along with Tyree Scott, of the lawsuits, they managed to use the lawsuits very effectively. They won support from their fellow workers. They managed to win elections in 1978 and 1980, so that they took over the major leadership roles within the union, everything except the president. The president was still this kind of conservative and arguably corrupt older leader, but they took over the dispatcher position, which is really important because the dispatcher is the one who assigns the workers to the jobs in Alaska, and he promised to sort of end the clientelism and corruption and cronyism that had prevailed and impose a more transparent meritocratic role, and Selmy Domingo, who took over the role as vice president. These were the two young leaders who led this whole sort of insurgent movement. 1981, the first day after the dispatch, after they won their election, several men walked into the office and shot them dead. Jean Viernes died immediately. Selmy Domingo was shot. He crawled out of the office into the street and lived for another day before he died, but he told the paramedics who shot him. And from the very beginning, other union members and allies of the cannery workers, this young group of cannery workers, claimed that this wasn't just some local thugs, the Bulasan gang. They're the ones who committed the murder, but it was part of a broader conspiracy. It was a conspiracy that was led by the union boss. They found, after all, that the gun that killed them was owned by the union boss and was found in a dumpster a few blocks away, and that it had been done with the complicity of local law enforcement officials, and that Ferdinand Marcos was the one who had funded the murder, had paid $50,000. And that was because they were opposing Ferdinand Marcos. They allied themselves with forces in the Philippines trying to bring down a dictator. And so Marcos didn't like that. And so you get this conspiracy. And that was immediately seen by people who were friends and allies and co-workers with Jean and Selmy. Initially, the prosecution in Seattle refused to see a conspiracy, saying that this is just a gangland murder. This is just one Filipino gang going after some local labor leaders who threatened to take away their corrupt business, and refused to see these linkages. So that the cannery workers developed a national coalition and funded a personal injury lawsuit, a wrongful death lawsuit, a civil lawsuit, trying to prove this claim. In 1989, they won. The first thing that happened, Marcos, because of the terrible publicity about all this, along with the fact that he was a dictator who was murdering tens of thousands of people and engaged in all kinds of human rights violations, lost support of the Reagan administration, which had supported him, as had previous presidents. He left, he was pushed out of the Philippines and he went to Hawaii, where he died in 1989. But the civil lawsuit that was filed wound on from 1982 to 1989, and they won. They proved in court that the murder of Selmy and Jean was as a result of conspiracy between the local union boss hiring the thugs that worked for the union boss, funded by Ferdinand Marcos, with the complicity of the American CIA and FBI, for the murder of these two young radical socialists who were challenging Marcos, but were also promoting progressive reform around the Puget Sound and Alaska. And then finally, the third of the discrimination lawsuits, disparate impact discrimination lawsuits, went to the Supreme Court. And this is in some ways the sort of bottom line of our whole story, and I'll use it to end. At this point, a couple of things had happened. That the activists had won 2 civil rights lawsuits, discrimination lawsuits, that had enabled them not only change conditions at the workplace to end, or at least moderate the patterns of discrimination and segregation, to win power at work, but also to take over the union and to win resources for political struggle to take on Marcos and to promote a socialist agenda. They'd also won the wrongful death lawsuit, the biggest personal injury lawsuit in Washington state history at that time, that brought down a dictator, which was unparalleled in American history. It was a major, major accomplishment. They didn't end up getting much money because at that point Marcos was dead, and there were so many people suing Marcos for wrongful death and murder and human rights violations that there wasn't any money left. But it's a huge symbolic victory to prove in court that the US government had been complicitous with local Seattle officials in this murder and assassination of political activists. This was the team that really pushed this. This is Cindy Domingo, Selmy Domingo's sister, Terry Mass, Selmy Domingo's spouse, and Mike Withey, who was the lawyer. So the final step in all this was the third of the discrimination lawsuits. They won as I mentioned, they won the first 2 of those. They won in court, and then they won in settlement, pretty ample compensation, damages for the discrimination that was done, and for the wages that were lost, and for the harmful and unhealthy conditions of work, and for the discrimination that they endured. But the third lawsuit, they lost at trial court in 1982. And that case originally went up to the US Supreme Court. The argument that they had made was that the canneries were organized in the same slave-based plantation model that they had been 100 years earlier. Filipino and Native Alaskans, indigenous people, were all relegated to the production line, the unsafe, unhealthy, low-wage, dead-end jobs, and were not allowed to compete for better jobs. That was their argument as a form of blatant discrimination. And it went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court used this case after a long, complicated legal history of at least 9 different appellate court decisions, most of which the cannery workers won. Went to the Supreme Court, and they used this as an opportunity to gut civil rights law. The white majority of Supremes, and I say the white majority because it was Justice White who wrote the majority opinion, so I refer to it as the white majority of the Supreme Court, ruled against the workers in Ward's Cove v. Atonia, which became a landmark civil rights ruling. The court rejected the theory of discrimination that the workers had advanced, called disparate impact. Secondly, that they narrowed civil rights law to a requirement that workers have to prove that discrimination by employers was intentional, which in the post-civil rights era is very, very difficult. How do you prove that somebody intended to discriminate and cause harm? Whereas what the workers had argued, as long as there were traditional practices and procedures that had racially discriminatory impacts, that should be sufficient to bring a cause of action. The courts in the 1970s and 1980s had agreed with that theory, but in Ward's Cove in 1989, the court reversed that, and they killed this doctrine of disparate impact. They also raised the evidentiary requirements for workers, making it harder for workers to bring cases, and they completely ignored the factual history. If you read the long decision by the majority opinion, they don't talk at all about the facts of blatant discrimination and harm in the canneries. They couch it all in abstract legal arguments. So this is, a hugely consequential case. The two of the dissenters, or the four dissenters, it was a 5-4 decision. Those who challenged the white majority said that this is outrageous. The salmon cannery resembles a plantation economy. It is a system of slavery. It's an old-fashioned sort of discrimination that everybody thought ended after the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Justice Blackmun writes, one wonders whether the majority still believes that race discrimination is a problem or even remembers that it ever was. Tyree Scott, who was involved in all of this, he was one of the architects of the whole campaign based on his own work for African American workers, said the Wards Cove case was really the death throes of the 64 Civil Rights Act in terms of employment. And we argued that basically what the court did was kill a very vibrant theory of anti-discrimination that had been used by African American workers, by workers of color, by Latino workers, Hispanic workers, and by women. I wrote another book called Rights at Work, which is all about the use of the same legal theory to challenge inequality of wages for women who are channeled into gender segregated work. And did so very effectively in the 70s and 80s, but that whole movement was killed by the Wards Cove decision because it took away this legal resource. And since then, we've seen the courts consistently undermine civil rights at work. The Reagan-era court, which was behind the challenge to the cannery workers in court who filed briefs in the EEOC, led by Justice Thomas, refused to bring any cases on basis of disparate impact and was very weak in terms of enforcing civil rights law, even in cases of intentional discrimination. And so the courts have narrowed workers' civil rights in other ways by undercutting class actions which in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, especially 70s and 80s, were crucial resources by which workers could organize together, pool their resources to challenge systematic discrimination, and therefore overcome the costs of individual discrimination. The courts began whittling that away at the same time in the late 1980s, and by the 1990s, worker class actions were basically dead. And I can go through, you've probably heard from other speakers talk about other actions by the courts and by the NLRB in terms of narrowing rights of organizing, rights of strikes, narrowing the designations of employees who can organize, authorizing support for right to work laws, which make it difficult for unions to organize, and go on and on and on. So that the story I'm telling here is about historically the ways in which law has supported racial capitalist hierarchy. But workers nevertheless have creatively, through persistence and commitment, been able to turn basic rights principles into resources for challenging those hierarchies and carving out some degree of freedom and power. But that's usually just for short moments. With every advance, there's almost always been a backlash. We saw the backlash of Taft-Hartley and then court decisions in the 1950s against whatever was gained through the Wagner Act and other rights in the 1950s. The rights that were advanced in the period of civil rights movement and then taken as powerful resources in the 70s and 80s by women and African Americans, Filipino workers and Mexican Americans were reversed, whittled away, and eviscerated by the late 1980s through the current period. And that's just a sort of, in a nutshell, the history of the relationship between law and racial capitalism. The point isn't that law is simply a shell or a front for racial capitalism to impose control and discipline and violence on workers, but it is that. But it also sometimes provides a resource for struggle. And the whole history of worker struggles has largely been, through that terrain, on that terrain of law, not just courts and legislation, but the basic principles and logic of property rights versus equality rights. I've written a lot about that with regard to major labor figures like A. Philip Randolph and many, many others. But that's the bottom line. So let me stop there. I'm about out of time, and sorry it took so long this morning. It didn't take nearly that long. Let me see what questions you might have. Question for Ashley. I know we're out of time, but can you talk about the localities, how localities are expanding employee rights in the absence of federal leadership? Well, absence of federal leadership. The problem is that federal courts and national government, the EEOC, which is sort of given up on all sort of defense of workers' rights, especially rights of minority workers, workers of color, and women, has created a context where struggles entirely have to be, to a large extent local. And there's various parts of the countries where workers have been much more successful in fighting for rights. Think about the $15 minimum wage battle in Washington state. Lots of protections for workers in safety and health, along with wages, have made some progress in Washington. Not nearly enough, but relative to other parts of the country. There are parts of the country, New York, Washington, California, where there's been a lot more room and space for workers to organize and unions to work with, and workers associations and legal establishments that at least provide some space for contesting the terms of capitalist hierarchy. But they've been very limited. In much of the country, there's virtually no space at all. The lack of unionization in the South, the right to work laws that impede, if not kill, the possibility for unionization, and the more hostile legal establishments all provide a much more negative, problematic, hostile environment for fighting these battles. We've got lots of battles going on now. I think one of the questions I would leave you with is we're in a moment now of crisis, the pandemic crisis. And moments of crisis often lead to periods of new crackdowns and repression, but they also lead to opportunities. The Depression opened up opportunities for workers in the New Deal era. The Cold War, fear of nuclear annihilation and World War created up opportunities for workers of color to leverage demands for equal rights. Crisis creates opportunities, but also creates enormous obstacles. One of the big questions is whether workers are going to be able to find ways to take advantage of the contemporary situation as an opportunity, at the same time that neoliberal forces of corporate America have been organizing for a long time to further the neoliberal agenda of controlling, disciplining workers, reducing wages, extending new forms of discipline and control, disempowering workers from organizing in unions and out of unions and other kinds of ways. That's the moment where we find ourselves. Question, where are the UW faculty against unionizing? Oh, don't get me started on that. A lot of it has to do with schisms among faculty. The faculty who are more privileged see that they are going to lose, and there's some logic to that. A lot of the, especially faculty in the top departments in the country, scientists, think that unionizing is going to redistribute wages and resources to other parts of the university that will undercut their status. And that's a big part of it. There's also concern that a lot of faculty members said, unions are for workers. We're not workers, we're professionals. That's always been an issue for professional people of all kinds, including teachers and nurses and so forth. It's complicated. I've been very involved in those battles. It's too big a question. Given my previous work on women's work and activism, Kim asks, as you comb through the documents in the book, did you find much that was saved about the role of Filipino women? Filipino women, you want to say. That's complicated because the book is very much about race and capitalism. And while we do address gender issues, for example, the importation of male workers reinstantiated and supported that traditional division of work between men outside of the home and women in domestic reproduction. And so gender plays in there. It's not much about women. Not until the second generation do you have women who become very active in the cannery workers movement. Women become really prominent after Sylvia and Jean were murdered in the Committee for Justice for Domingo and Viernes. It's largely led by women. Cindy Domingo, Sylvia Domingo's sister, Terry Mass, his wife, others in the Domingo family, a whole variety of women become really the powerful, strong women become the activists that made that movement to try and prove that there was an assassination conspiracy work. And women were very active in that. It wasn't so much in the Cannery Workers Union, although there were some women like Terry Mass. Terry Mass went on to be, now she is president of the Inland Boatmen's Union, or she's gone through different levels of leadership within Inland Boatmen's Union, which is what ILW U37 became. But I'm interested in the parallelism, how women use legal strategies, not just anti-discrimination law, but mobilizing around anti-discrimination law to organize women in the workplace, to unionize them, to take these struggles to the collective bargaining and especially to file lawsuits precisely to leverage collective bargaining. They weren't going to court mainly to win, they were using that so that they could have greater power in collective bargaining. And that was very much the story that I told about women, including in Seattle, in Washington State, which was one of the leaders of that whole movement at the time. So the ways in which gender and race figure differently in law, but there's a lot of parallels in the ways in which women and workers of color have used legal strategies along with grassroots mobilizing and unionizing strategies to try and carve out some power and to make good on the minimal promise of equal rights, which is a frail, unrealized, but at least potential challenge. I don't know if that answered that. I think we're done. I don't know if Kim, hi Kim, how are you? Kim England, hi Kim, I know you.
I had one more if you've still got.
Absolutely.
Right. I was just curious, with the introduction of Tyree Scott, I mean, I had students asking me, why had I never heard of this person before who seems to be so sort of, he's sort of adjacent to but integral to the work of organizing throughout the 50s, 70s, and 80s throughout his life. I'm kind of curious to know whether or not you think, are there lessons we could take from his approach to organizing that might actually be able to guide us, through this crisis moment that we're in today?
Oh my, yes, absolutely. I think one thing I'll say, I mean, Tyree was somebody who was very committed to worker organizing and actually committed to unions, but much of his work was against unions because they were white, exclusionary, segregated unions. And he used civil rights law to try and challenge those unions with the goal of trying to integrate workplaces. And that's one of the ironies of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, was that it ended up, because it provided individuals and groups of people resources to challenge not only owners and employers, but also unions. It ended up doing damage to unions, which is exactly what workers of color needed. And those were not mistakes. Many of the people who fought those battles were very aware of that paradox, but it was just part of the paradoxical situation of law. And that's one thing, and since then things have changed a lot because a lot of unions have desegregated and have sort of drunk the Kool-Aid and recognized, actually organizing women and people of color is a good strategy for growing and developing power. So that's one thing. But I think why Tyree attracted me, I met him in the 1990s. And began to engage in a number of activities with him. And then he was very involved in the Battle of Seattle, the WTO affair and so forth. And I began learning the story and interviewing him in the late 1990s, actually. That his way of understanding law is that law is a set of resources. It's a set of rhetorical discursive resources. We have a tradition of rights, and that tradition of rights to equality is juxtaposed, as Marx understood, against property rights. And historically, property rights always trump rights of citizenship. The inequalities that property rights protect, and inequalities of profit accumulation and devaluation of people, and in conjunction with race that devalues low-wage workers, that's the dilemma of America, but there is the promise of equality. And if there's ways to mobilize around that promise of equal rights, not just in a formal, procedural, thin sense, but in a substantive sense, to promote equality against property and the inequalities property represents, that is a discursive resource. And that's what he did. And that's what long histories of workers of color and women workers have done. But realize you just don't go to court. What he understood was you can't rely on courts. Courts tend to be conservative institutions, but by filing lawsuits, you can use lawsuits to mobilize workers at the workplace, to generate publicity on behalf of rights causes, inequality causes, and use that as resources to try and compel employers and legislators to change the rules of the game. It's not always going to work. He had amazing success, but that was a moment. That was a little moment in history where he had incredible success, and it's precisely because of that that the courts and government shut down this legal resource. Corporations say, these people are mobilizing effectively against us and we're having to give in to their demands. And so they shut it down. I mean, that's how history works, is Law answers to the most powerful people. And the people who are workers, low-wage workers, unwaged workers, workers who are discriminated against and subjugated positions have to find those little windows where rights can be reconstructed for new kinds of battles. And that's what happened in the 30s and 40s, some degree what happened in the 60s and 70s. And the question to me is, those strategies of mobilizing rights, we're in a period now where obviously the old order and certainly the neoliberal order that's prevailed since 2008 is a mess. And what kind of opportunities does that suggest? Does that open up? We have government giving away billions and trillions of dollars in all kinds of ways. Well, if they can do that, why can't they give it to workers instead of giving it to corporations? If anything's dramatized the incredible failure of our healthcare system or the lack of a healthcare system, the pandemic has done that. That's an opportunity. Am I optimistic that workers and progressive forces are going to be able to take advantage of that? Not particularly, but it's an opportunity we've got to fight like hell to try and turn it into an opportunity that's going to matter. And that's what partly the history. You've got to find when those windows open, you have to take advantage of it. And it's not just going to be legal battles. We are now facing a legal order in federal courts that are radically right-wing, more so than any time. Courts have always been conservative, but this is a whole new level of conservative, pro-property, pro-corporate, anti-worker. So, but there's other legal resources. There's both the discursive resources and other legal, but there's less opportunity to mobilize law in the ways that I talk about and written about it now than in the past. Or maybe not. I may just not be seeing them. That's the challenge, is creating new ways of seeing and understanding and acting.
Well, if my optimism hinges on something getting past you, I'm taking the glass half empty approach there. But I do feel like this was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your work. It's absolutely unbelievable. I can't wait to pick up the book. And again, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you being willing to share your time with this group tonight.
Happy to. Sorry I took too long. Again, I thought I could get it all in a shorter time, but it's a 500-page book, and I get excited about it.
I could have sat here and listened to you all.
Thanks for showing up.
Excellent. All right, everybody, have a fantastic rest of your week. Thanks again.
Take care. Let's make something good. A new normal, a new better normal. That's what we need.
Excellent. Thanks again, Mike. That was fantastic. I really, really appreciate that.
Sure. Take care, everybody. Stay safe and well.